Well, absolute pleasure to be here and hosting the panel for the 2024 Evolution Summit. As Paul said, the panel this year is going to be around game design and UX design. So a fantastic lineup, and we've got 3 really interesting questions to discuss this year as well, so looking forward to it. Before we get into the questions, though, we're going to do some introductions. So, Anna, please kick us off.
All right. My name is Anna Högberg-Nelius, and I am an indie developer, the token indie on this panel. I've been working with games for 13 years. Right now I run a studio called Valiant Game Studio, so I both make games with that studio and also work as a consultant for other studios. So I work primarily with game design and narrative design for others, but some other stuff as well. I'm also one of the organizers of Linkin Bar, if anyone has been to that. Yay! We celebrated 10 years this year. Yeah, Erik?
Sweet. Hi, everyone. My name is Erik Ortman. I've been in games also around 13 years at this time, working mostly with UX. I'm the UX director at the GLS here in Stockholm. Fairly new studio. We're building the football game that we think gaming deserves, which means we're doing a bunch of cool tech and, most importantly, a really cool game on top of that tech. Early days for us still, but you should keep an eye on us. We're doing cool stuff.
Sweet, yeah. So hello everyone, I'm Faraz Musmar. Started working around 17 years ago. Most of it in the gaming industry. I had a short stint in a 4-year stint in investment banking and financial consulting. But the rest of my career, I've been a game designer. I worked on freemium mobile games, AAA games like Battlefield, Star Wars Battlefront 2, etc. And now I'm a product director at TTK Games, a new studio in Stockholm. We've been around for 2 years now, working on the next generation of shooters. And hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Abigail Rindo. I'm the head of creative for Candy Crush Soda at King. I've been in games for about 12 years, spending most of that time doing freemium mobile as well as educational and serious games. I've worked as in narrative, production, art, and UX and game design. And right now my job is really about making sure everybody who's in the creative crafts on the Candy Crush Soda Saga team have what they need to do their jobs, basically.
Fantastic. Yeah, give him a round of applause. Okay, so we're going to kick off with the first question that we've got, which is how game developers, game designers, UX designers manage the demands between what the market expects and how games can be both ethical and responsible. And I think this was a question that you kind of proposed when we were discussing these first questions, so I'm going to come to you and if you can kick us off.
Sure. And to kick it off, I think it's important to start by acknowledging like how much power and influence we have as game developers. Because like I think it's 2-point-something billion people play games, digital games around the world. And we are saying something to them, whether we like it or not, or we're saying nothing, and that's also something we should be aware of. I think it should be a conscious decision to be, I don't know, it's just for fun, quote unquote, like it's just entertainment, there's no message here. Or if we have a message, it should be deliberate, and we shouldn't accidentally tell our players something. And then we should consider, what are we telling our players? Which values are we sort of showing in our games? What type of future are we showing them? How are the characters portrayed, and so on? I just think it's so important to both within the games really take seriously what we are conveying, and also how we're treating the players as well, which is part of this question. Like how, like when it comes to monetization, how are we treating them? Do we exploit children with our monetization systems and so on? So like because our gamers are so plentiful and so diverse, I think it's so important to actually take it seriously what we are doing in our games. It's not just games, it's not just fun. We are way too big for that. We are by far the biggest medium in the world, and we need to realize that and really take it seriously.
That's really, really interesting. I think, like you say, like especially like games are so big now, and there's so many players out there, and so many games out there as well, right? So inevitably, like the time we spend with games is huge, right? And I think that's another aspect, like a big responsibility that we have as game makers is to consider like the attention economy around games as well, right? How much players are spending time on our games, and how they're spending that time. And I think there's a lot we can do there as game makers around, for example, how we punish disengagement in games and stuff like that, right? How do we get players to spend time in our games? But we have a tendency, I think, to go a little bit too much on fighting for that attention economy because it is such it's a ruthless business as well.
Yeah, I think for us as an industry, we have some sort of branding also considerations we need to have. So I mentioned, I worked for a while in the investment banking field, and maybe people will agree it's not always has the best reputation. But there's a strong focus in it on ethics in terms of they let people that do financial analysis pass ethics exams. They talk about it internally. Whether they believe in it or not, that's not a conversation for today, but it helps the outer brand of the industry. And the thing is, when you look at, for example, whenever there's violence in the world, politicians, sometimes regulations, tend to use video games as an excuse, even though there's studies that show there's no correlation between video game violence and real-world violence. We get used as a scapegoat sometimes. So for us as an industry, if we work on our branding in terms of focus on ethics and actually as designers put that culture within the studio and teach our teams to think about that as a daily basis, that will help us a lot. And it's also, I think there's the ethical standards in terms of your responsibility to the players, but also you have a responsibility towards the company to make a good product. And then eventually you have a responsibility towards your own team. If you're proposing things in the game that will lead that your team will do overtime or work under unethical work conditions, that's something you should think about as well as a leader in the industry, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we as leaders, we are in a position to influence so many of these decisions, right? And I think one of the things that you mentioned was that the amount of time that's spent, and sometimes, like in the games that I work on, some of these players have been working on them for a decade, or playing them for a decade, excuse me. And I think we can't underestimate the influence that has. So I think we have to be intentional with the content that we're showing our players. We're really lucky to have a really nice inclusive design program at King that also includes that content. I know we're talking about inclusive design later, but I think the two are married. I think it's really important that we consider ourselves stewards to some extent and take care of our players when it comes to that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I just want to add on the violence and making people violent. That's absolutely the case. Like, games do not make people violent. We know this. There may been so many meta studies on this now. However, I'm also on the side of because I'm now making a non-violent car battler, and I realized I didn't have the language to talk about this game without using violent language, because so many games have for so long relied on basically just depicting violence. Even if it's fantasy violence, it's still hit points, it's still hurting, it's still killing. And I think that's a little bit weird, that we have such a focus on it. So when it comes to ethics, which stories are we telling? Why doesn't even if it's jumping on the head of a mushroom, it's still you are doing something to something else, and now it's not there anymore. And there are other stories we can tell, and I think we get stuck quite easily of just telling the same stories that are often quite destructive. And if we want a better world, I think we need to also tell other stories. I'm not saying we can't tell those stories as well, but we should also tell more, in my opinion, constructive and positive stories, because people just know what they see. And if we want to work for a better future, if we want to work towards a better planet, we also need to show that it's possible to have, we can survive this, we can get through this together. So we have to show that as an alternative as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even keeping that in mind could encourage designers and developers in general to be more creative. The thing is, why is violence so common in games or action movies? It sells, but it's also really simple to explain. If you give someone a sword in a game, they're going to try to find the button where they swing it. But if you give them a book and a pen, they'll need to think a bit more, okay, what should I write in it? What can I do with that book? So for us as designers as well, it's an encouragement for us to start thinking, if I want to design around violence, most probably my game will be a little bit more creative than it is. As a result of that, it's something to enhance the experience for the player, but also push the boundaries of creativity for us as developers, I think.
We as game designers often talk about verbs, and I think too often the list of verbs is limited. We ignore verbs like nurture, grow, build. So much of it's around destroy, and I'd love to see. And I think there are spaces where that's happening, and I think there's a appetite for that. We just need to make sure that the industry recognizes it and not just the players. I will say that sometimes the games that follow these verbs aren't considered real games, and that's a problem.
I think there's an interesting aspect to that as well, and that, of course, it is how we choose words and how we portray our games, but it's also how players approach our games, because that's, as you mentioned, Miguel, a big part of it is that how players actually play our games, right? And I think that's an interesting aspect of it, like just that sort of sometimes moral ambiguity that no matter how we portray our games, players can choose to approach our games in any which way, basically. But it's also one of the aspects that makes games very interesting, like a game like Baldur's Gate, right, where you have all of these moral ambiguous choices you can go for, and that's sort of part of what makes that game interesting and living those fantasies as well, and like seeing the implications of what that is. So, there's part of the value in games is offering that breadth of different like moral choices and ambiguity as well.
I think consequences are a big part of that, right? Like having someone do something and having someone see the consequences of those actions. Verb equates action, but sometimes we obfuscate what the action really is. And I think that it's something that's really important to look at, because you're right, it's more impactful when you show that consequence.
And I think you mentioned earlier, like, ethics and responsibility might not just be around violence, but also around like monetization as well, and different forms of responsibilities with games. So maybe you could speak a little bit on how leaders approach that mindset at the start of a new project. It's like, how can we monetize this, but how can we keep it responsible and make sure that it is ethical at the same time?
I mean, I'm an indie, I make premium games, so I'm not this one to talk about this. I sell a game, you buy it, and that's it. It's not monetized for that, because in my opinion, I want to say the most ethical, but at least like there is no subscription. Like you can't just, it's very hard to exploit someone that way.
Yeah.
So, but I'll let you talk about it.
Oh, I mean, I think I believe that we should make games for everyone, and sometimes lowering the threshold to get access to those games allows it to be for everyone, right? I think the way that you make sure that you're staying in that feel-good realm is to talk to your players, right? It's so important to just constantly communicate with your players.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's a lot about your intent as well as a designer in a specific moment. So we've seen in games before dark UX patterns that have been shunned by now, because also as a developer, when you do something like this, you realize that you're not doing it for the right reasons. At the end of the day, it's a question about value. Whenever you're doing something in a game or selling something in a game, you should ask yourself this question: are you providing value to the players? And are you doing this in a clear, precise way for them? And that should be your guiding lines in terms of that. You should not have dark UX patterns in your game, for example. Because from an ethical perspective, it's horrible, but from a business practice, it's very short term.
Yeah.
You want to build loyalty from the players in your games anyways, from business consideration, and you do that by not deceiving the players. You do that by being upfront.
Yeah. I think that it's a maturity thing in the industry as well, and I think we're seeing that improve. It's still not great, but to your point, like the fact that the entry point to games by having free-to-play games there is great. Like the lower barrier of entry is fantastic. More games you can play, which means they need to monetize. But there are ways that you can monetize these games. Again, from a UX perspective, just by not using dark UX patterns around, for example, how you obfuscate things through currencies or how you market things to kids and all of these things, right? So there's a lot of value you can provide without going into that manipulative territory. And I think, again, as a sort of industry, we've matured a little bit. We still have a long way to go there as well.
Yeah, I think it's extra important to think about this when it comes to kids, especially, because like it would be so easy, right? Like literally taking money from children. But like I think like putting in those checks and balances, like it's actually kind of hard. Like you need to have a parental, some form of parental lock or something to make purchases, or maybe you can only make a certain amount at a time, or whatever it might be, or just have a few items. Just thinking about this, I think is very, very important, because like if we want to be here for a long time, not just making a quick buck, it's going to be so important, because then we build that kind of relationship with our players. So yeah.
Right, but we're going to move on to the second question, and Abigail alluded to it just briefly there before. So it's going to talk about how game designers and UX designers can ensure that games are accessible and inclusive, as you know, the audience for games, as you were saying before, is so large and it becomes much more diverse. So yeah, how can you approach that in a diverse and inclusive way? Faraz, maybe do you want to kick us off on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy that this is becoming a very common topic in the gaming industry. Unfortunately, it's not always actioned upon. It's more like talked upon sometimes. So I'm happy we're even like discussing it today. It's a good chance to add more awareness to it. The thing is, in a lot of closed doors meetings or whatever, when you're discussing adding inclusivity features or accessibility features to games, I've seen sometimes reactions from people in a way that this is like a purely ethical or an emotional decision, which it should be by itself a justification to have in games, right? There's people that need to play video games, and having these features for them will change their lives, and we have the opportunity to do so by adding small features. But what's also something that maybe is not talked enough about is having these inclusive features in the game is also good to you from a business sense as well. Like, it could range from a lot of things. I don't know, like how many people in the audience are left-handed? Like if we raise our left hands together. So it's roughly, in the world, it's 10% of the world are left-handed people. There was a myth that we die 9 years younger. That's not true anymore. So anyone left-handed in the audience, it's a myth. The thing is, once you add, and this is like a simple accessibility feature, you add left-handedness support to the game, now you have 10% of your audience way happier than before. Like a very bad example of this, for example, Link in The Legend of Zelda is left-handed. He's one of the few left-handed protagonists in the gaming industry. The Wii came out, had motion controls. Link was right-handed. So I waited my whole life to swing his sword with my left hand. And then at that point, you had to use your right hand. These sort of things stick with you. Like the Wii came out and Skyward Sword came out in 2009. So we're talking 15 years. And now I'm on a stage talking about it. So this is very important in terms of also how players would remember the games and connect with them. So there's so much layers to this beyond than, oh, we're doing this because we're nice people. No, it's important for the players. It builds loyalty. It builds memorable moments. It's good for your business. And it doesn't cost so much. So it's an extremely important thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. Because like we said, like, what is it, 2 billion people play games. You are going to have all types of players that play your games. And why not, you know, especially some features aren't that, as I said, they're quite cheap to implement. So why wouldn't you? Like, if you can expand your player base even more, why not? And also, a lot of accessibility features are good for everyone. So it's just good practice to put them in anyway. Like, I don't know, subtitles, stuff like that. Like, it's the a rising tide lifts all ships thing. Like, no one, you know, will, have a worse experience because of these accessibility features, but some people have a way better experience. So it's a non-brainer.
Yeah, it's totally true. And
No, please go ahead.
I think we found that even putting the accessibility features just in a regular settings menu, people recognize it and use it more often because they recognize that it lifts the boat for everybody. But I do think when making these decisions, so often we think about it at the end of development, and that's usually too late. And so I think it's really important that as you're creating, as you're designing, as you're even thinking about the verbs and the content that you're putting together, you make sure that you're thinking about the different types of players that you're designing for. I think just even something as simple as opening up an affordance to give a player more agency can just open up your game to so many more players and give them so many more options.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also what we see happen a lot. And coming back to, again, how many players are out there, right? There's a lot of studios out there that still work and live under the mantra of, like, we're building games that we want to play ourselves, right? And I mean, frankly, successfully so to some degree, maybe despite that, not because of that, right? But what ends up happening then is that, like, we go and we try to put ourselves into the shoes of the player, right? Because we are the player, but you end up in this kind of perspective-taking angle which is just fraught with biases and it's impossible to get away from, versus what inclusive design is really all about, is to go on the opposite end and then basically seek perspectives rather than take perspectives, right? To basically state to yourself, even though, yes, you might be a player of your game, you do not represent all the ways the player will play your game and all the players that will play your game. So doing the work of inclusive design is really like that process, that methodology of going out and talking to the players, like gathering qualitative data, not just numbers, not just stats on who is playing your game, but what are they actually saying, how are they thinking, how are they playing. That's a huge part of it.
And watching them play,
Yes.
because they will
Yes.
surprise you every
Every
time.
time,
Yeah, I hear that phrase, we're making games for ourselves, too often used to treat players poorly. And I think we really need to get past that as an industry, honestly.
And I think the point you mentioned about the timing, like you've seen this in so many games that, oh, we're close to launch, first party requires some accessibility features, let's start building them. It's already too late, the developers are trying to get the game outside the door. The thing is, if you engage early, and that's, I think, what I would suggest to a lot of studios, engage early with, there's so many institutions out there that are doing this even for free. They would just come over, they would talk to you, get in touch with some even NGOs, do a charity stream, meet the people that these features help. Let your team meet them early on, and then they will stick in the minds of the developers while the game is being developed early, instead of doing this in the last 6 months, because we all know how things look like before you ship. It's too busy. No one's going to have time to think about this. So it has to be there from the beginning, and it has to be also coming from the team. So it's not enough for the leadership to say, we want our game to be inclusive. We want to also the team's buy-in. So engaging with different organizations, meeting the people that these features are built for, will stick with your developers, I'm sure.
I think so much of the time this work is done by a few passionate people on the team. And so I think it's really important to have those organizations talk to the producers, you know, all of the leaders in the team too, so that they understand and see the value of it, because then that will happen early on in their development, right? And the right resources will be allocated towards it.
On a positive note, like the tools that are out there to both do inclusive design but also build accessibility features is super right now compared to 5 years ago. Even like most of the engines that we work on come out of the box with an immense set of tools, and it's so like the barrier of entry to do good accessibility in games is so much lower now, which is great, and we're going to see much more of it. So.
Yeah, I personally love Xbox. You know, they just came out with the accessibility toolkit. It's available online. It's so great.
Yeah.
We've been digging into it as a team, and it's just it's been such a great resource for
It's a
us.
gold mine.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to go for the third and final question. So this is about narrative design is increasingly being used to sustain player retention in live service games. So again, the role of UX and game designers, how can they use narrative design to keep that retention and over a sustainable way, and what challenges you face with that? Abigail, I know you were looking forward to speaking on this one, so do you want to start?
Well, I'm always excited to talk about narrative. I've done a couple talks about this, but I think in general, like when it comes to designing our live operations games, we have a tendency to think, oh, it doesn't need narrative because it keeps going and it doesn't have an ending. Everybody assumes that a story has to have an ending, and it makes them nervous when they think about that they may have to write stories that don't end. But there's so many. If you look outside of Western storytelling, there's so many examples like Keisho Hentetsu, which is from the Japanese tradition, like Tales of Genshi and that kind of thing. Indigenous stories, they all have very cyclical looping cycles that are super interesting, and I think there's so much intrinsic value, because you think about these live service games, I think we were talking about this earlier, players spend so much time with it, they spend years with it, and so there's so many little individual storylets and nuggets that you can grant them as they're playing, even if their sessions are short or if their sessions are long, and they build this lore in their head, and it's a really beautiful thing, right? That engagement, you get that wonderful fandom that can be so powerful.
Yeah, and it's, I guess, also from a player retention perspective, I feel it's such a tool that is underutilized. Like, there's a strong focus in terms of looking at different metrics, different engagement systems. I spent a lot of time even designing those, so I get why, and they're extremely important. But then there's this tool that's right in front of us that I think, for example, in a lot of single-player games, the key retention tool is actually the narrative and the story of the game. It's not all the other systems. While in live service games, it's underutilized. Again, there's a lot of reasons. The production cycle is crazy. Once your season is out, you needed the previous season to be in, etc. But I think also another layer related to narrative is one of the key predictors for player churn is actually the player's friends dropping out of the game. And it's very hard to keep everyone's friends retained in one game. Maybe you can retain 10 of the users, etc. But if your friends drop out from a game, they're going to take you to another game. The thing is, if the narrative is strong enough, you get players to discuss it outside of the game. Most probably your friends will also stick to see what's going to happen next. And I think this is underutilized in video games.
And I also think there's something to be said about social motivations applying to characters as well. Like you can form pro-social relationships with characters the same way you do with other players. And I think sometimes that also acts as that bridge that keeps people engaged within the game.
Yeah, I remember at the end when I finished Disco Elysium, I was extremely sad because I'm not going to spend any more time with Ken Kasuragi, for example. And that's such an amazing feeling to have from a video game.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that the social aspect is like you can't really understate how important that one is. And I feel like, and I say that as a UX designer, especially guilty of that sometimes, like in the spirit of like usability, we tend to go for efficiency a lot of times, and we go for these very simple, efficient, highly usable loops, but we miss out on the fact that like sometimes the most efficient solution is not the most liked solution. And like one of my favorite examples of that, I don't know how many like OG World of Warcraft raiders are out there, but like if you remember like going on a raid back in the days, like going to Onyxia with your guild, that was an adventure. You went out in the world, you existed in the world, anything could happen. There was a bunch of emergent storytelling that happened there. It was an investment, right? An enemy guild would come and gank you and open, like, everything could happen. And then they added the raid finder for the sake of efficiency, right? Because they wanted people to explore more of the content, and it was a good thought process behind it. But it meant that people existed way less in the world and was way more less invested in the world. And I think that again, like a lot of players hated it because again, it took away from that feeling of being in the world with a social connection to it and being together and being on an adventure. So I think again, we go for efficiency sometimes too hard, but I think for the long-term retention, that feeling of being invested in the world and in the universe and not just in the systems is super important.
Yeah, and I mean, as human beings, we are storytellers. That's kind of what we do. Like, we tell stories to each other. That's one of the things we love the most, kind of. And so it's definitely one of the best retention tools that we have. But like we have been talking about, like how to do it, and like especially in the Western canon, the kind of stories we tend to tell tend to have an end, which is a challenge, obviously. But yeah, this like emergent storytelling. Not just what you do together, but also what are stories you tell your friends afterwards. Like, oh, that's why, for example, Crusader Kings is like really great because the stories just happen, and you will have a story that no one else has had, which is really, really cool. Or it could be Minecraft, it could be something else. Like, you will have your unique story, and of course that depends on what kind of game you're making, because it needs to be built into the game design, obviously, features. But still, if you can get people to talk about your game and it's their story, it's not just a story you've been spoon feeding them, that's really powerful, because that can also, it's going to be evergreen in a way that just you typing something can't really be. So you're saving yourself a lot of trouble. Like, it's going to be harder in the beginning to design for that kind of storytelling, but if you can build systems where the story sort of happens in an emergent way, that's going to really pay off, I think, on the other side, especially in like live service games, I think.
Yeah, and I think highlighting the payoff is extremely important. Like, I've seen this in so many teams that the narrative team or the narrative designers, they're looked at as if they're a cost center. So they're going to come in and it's like, oh, here's the narrative guys again. They want to write stuff in the game. But then at the end of the day, it's also, I'm focusing on it from, as you said, like the long-term payout. Players will stay longer in the game. We will provide a better experience for the players. And from a business perspective, it is going to end up being better for your product. It's more valued, it's beefier, but then as a result of this engagement, you'll most probably end up having more monetization if your game has monetization, sell more boxes, etc. So it makes sense from a business perspective. We need to move away from looking at narrative as a cost center. They're actually a very solid revenue center, in my opinion.
Totally agree.
I think we're about there with the time as well, actually. So we've done okay. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Really, really interesting talks. Please give them a big round of applause.